presentation kind of unfolds, I'll find something meaningful to say to you about what we're going to show. One of the key things for us is this concept of creating places for people. We followed the traditional route of architectural exploration, particularly in the retail genre, for many, many years. And we looked, before we started designing these things, we were looking at those malls that you're all very familiar with here in the Philippines. You have a plethora of them. And these are all malls that we would describe as the American model. Fully enclosed, totally fully air conditioned, totally secure, a key entrance point which is closed at a specific time during the day. And then we started looking at where this model actually came from. Why did it actually happen? And we started to realize that maybe in the context of our major market, which is in China, maybe that model wasn't quite functional. So when we started looking at the history of this development, we realized that the American model was premised on one key factor that goes back to the beginning of the 20th century, and that is the ubiquitous, widespread use of private cars. The use of the private car gave rise to this phenomenon called urban and suburban sprawl. Because people were independently mobile, and because that mobility was very, very cheap in relative terms, it was possible for developers to push townships out onto the periphery and beyond, and to create this massive suburban landscape in which people were totally connected by the use of the automobile. That then allowed the concept of how to service such a suburban area to be considered. And what actually resulted was the possibility of producing mega malls. Mega malls that are actually quite remote from the urban areas, from the residential areas of the urban environment. So that meant they could occupy vast amounts of farmland out there on the periphery of the suburbs. And people would drive 30 miles, 40 miles, and go and spend a whole day in this massive complex. So all of that made perfectly good internal logical sense. Let's not consider the kind of environmental impact of that for the moment, but just from a social development point of view and from an economic development point of view, it kind of made sense to do that. Come forward to this century and Asia, and we landed up scratching our heads saying, well, actually, you know, what we're seeing in the China market is this model of mall being kind of teleported in and dropped into the center of cities. The model doesn't work. And it doesn't work because we're working in an environment where we do not have private, ubiquitous access to private cars. Despite the much vaunted problems with traffic jams and all the rest of it in the big cities of China, those vehicles are not uniquely privately owned. So basically what we're seeing now emerge in 2017 is a rather large number of failures of these typical malls. And we think that from a commercial point of view, there's actually quite a big opportunity there to go in and try and work out what you can do with a failed mall to turn it into something useful that might work. So essentially we were looking at, we thought, the wrong typology in the wrong place at the wrong time. So then the question was, so what is right? The title of this festival is Context and Intent. And back then, 15 years ago, we were actually thinking about context. So we started to study the places that we were being asked to work in. And one of the first opportunities that came up was a project which we did. Some of you may have seen it last year when my colleague Billy Kwan presented. A project that we did in Beijing. It's called, originally it was called Sanlitun Village. Sanlitun is an area in the northeast of Beijing. It's within the city limits. It's actually in the sort of embassy district of Beijing. Quite heavily residential. It also has a big workers' sports stadium there, which goes back to the early days of the Communist Party rule. And it's also an area which is quite vibrant in terms of nightlife. In the old days, 20 years ago in Beijing, if you wanted to go out for a beer in a bar, you would go there because there was one street called Bar Street. It's actually Sanlitun Road, and it was just littered with actually illegal buildings along the sidewalks, but they were great bars. Good, you could really have a good time out there. Wind forward, and of course land values have gone through the roof. All of those bars have had to move out because they're no longer affordable. The client that we had, a mainland Chinese developer, came to us and said, we need to do something. We have a very large tract of land. Can you help us? Fortunately, and this is one of the tricks as architects that one of the bits of serendipity as architects you might want to look for one day. This particular client was not a shopping center operator. Be pretty blunt, he didn't know what he was doing. He got a lot of money, he got the land rights, and he knew he needed to do something, and it had to be commercial, it had to be retail, but he didn't know how. So we took a very large gamble, and we proposed to him an alternative in-town model that was premised on an understanding of how the culture of Beijing works. Not the culture of China, how the culture of that city works. How the culture of that location actually works. And we went right back into the history of empire, of the emperors, in order to work out how this district had developed. And we suddenly realized that actually all the fully enclosed, fully air-conditioned environments that have recently popped up in that country are actually quite alien to the way in which the local population lives. The local population is very familiar with living outdoors. Now, bear in mind, Beijing has extremes of temperature. Unbelievably hot and dry in the summer. You're talking 35, 40 degrees of heat in the center of the city. In the winter, it drops down to minus 20 plus, minus 20, minus 25 degrees. Very little snow, it's just bitterly, bitterly cold. Okay. So the conventional wisdom was, well, look, if you build anything which isn't a fully enclosed mall, you're going to have a problem because everybody wants to be comfortable. They don't want to be cold, and they don't want to be hot. We took the contrary view and said, actually, the history of the city is about people being hot and being cold, summer and winter, and they know how to deal with it. If you get hot, you do things that will cool you down. If you get cold, you put on more clothes. The key point, though, was this external element rather than the internal element. The social external element was actually the people's social means of communication. So you look around Beijing and you see all the courtyards, the plazas, the courtyard houses, indeed, as well. And all of those courtyards were areas of communications where people would gather, they would get together either privately in the family courtyard house or publicly in the district square, in the plazas around town. And that is where that kind of communication and dialogue amongst people actually happened. And our argument was that if we were to be able to produce something that captured some of that, that kind of grabbed a little bit of that culture, we might actually be able to push through an adaptation of the mall model that might work for that particular environment. That mall opened, I don't have an image of it here, that mall opened in 2008, just at the beginning of the opening of the Beijing Olympics. That was by decree, by the way. It was government insisted it had to open, so there was a real deadline for us. And from the moment that it opened, it actually proved to be mercifully extremely popular. Along that journey to get to the opening, the little twist in the story, another bit of serendipity, was that the original developer actually practically went bust. He actually ran out of money. He had nothing. At the time, the state banks were squeezing on credit. They were not making loans available to developers. And so basically, the developer had nowhere to go. He was just back against the wall and had nothing, no resources that he could draw on. So we suggested that maybe we could introduce him to one of the larger Hong Kong developers who might just be interested because of the location of the site. It was actually a very, very good location. That's when we brought in Swire Properties, which has developed a whole range of shopping centres, both conventional and unconventional, throughout Hong Kong and now increasingly in China, the Taikoo range of centres. And simply made a very simple introduction between the two developers. Kind of very long story short, Swire bought the entire project, exit the original developer with no experience and no money, well actually now a lot of money, because the amount that they paid for was billions for the site and the existing state of the building. Enter Swire Properties with rather deep pockets, an eye on the ideal location of the site, but having to look at something which already had an architectural constraint on it. The buildings were already coming out of the ground, and there was very little that they could do other than stick some dynamite into it in order to change this from its original design intent into a conventional mall. So again, this little kind of bit of serendipity, we just got very, very lucky with the timing and the circumstances around this. Swire agreed to continue with the concept of the open city. And the open city concept that we came up with is very simple. What it says is, you study the adjacencies to your site. You don't ignore them, you study them. You study the history, you study the texture, you study the pattern, you study the transportation, you study the traffic flow running through, and you study the culture within those local areas, immediately adjacent to you, because that's your catchment. And then you try and integrate that. You try and make sure, or rather you try and make sure that your project integrates into that. What that means is that any building above ground, any construction above ground, needs in some way to adapt the town plan grain. So you're looking at where are the lanes, where are the footpaths, where are the main roads, and how do these intersect with our site? And bring those lanes through the site. So essentially what we were doing was creating not buildings initially, but public realm. We were cutting the site from side to side and making this whole area, the whole site area, completely porous. Okay? You can enter that site from north, south, east, or west. There is no door. There is no gate. There is no way you can lock the premises when you want to kick all your shoppers out at 9:30, 10 o'clock at night and say, hey guys, you know, we've taken as much money from you as we can. We don't really want you hanging around anymore. Please go out, lock the door, come back tomorrow morning 10 o'clock, okay, and spend some more. You can't do it. This place is 24/7. So humongous problems came out of that. Can you imagine what the operations guys in Swire had to say when they were confronted with this? They looked at this and said, but what, how? How is this place going to be secure? I mean, you know, we've got security guys. They're going to, you tell me we've got to have security 24/7? We can't lock. How can we lock? How? How can we secure it? And we said, well, it's actually very simple. You can't. But we have to. We said, no, actually, you probably don't. If you just have a look around you, the surrounding areas, study what's going on around you, residential, little bits of shops, bars, restaurants, all that kind of stuff going on. Do they have 24/7 security? No, they don't. When they're ready to go home and stop business, they pull the shutters down, lock the door, and go home. Finished. That's the only security they have. So why do we need any more in this kind of environment? This was a major problem. The next problem was, listen, you know, you've done all this kind of public realm stuff out here, you know, kind of trees. God, first of all, we don't like trees. Retailers don't want trees because it hides the logo. Unfortunately, talk to the retailers, and we work directly with retailers as well at the micro level, and they go, yeah, it's cool. We like our shops to look like they're participating in a kind of green environment. We like the shading effect of this. We like the ability for people to stop and hang under a tree which has got a nice broad canopy and feel cool in the shade, because that helps them enjoy what's in our shop window, and they might come in and buy. So there's this incredible counterpoint between, on the one hand, the developers and the owners, and on the other hand, the retailers themselves within that shopping and mall environment. And they actually don't really understand each other. So this actually became kind of clear to us as we went through. The thing that became most abundantly clear as we went through all of this was that by adopting this open city concept, below grade, the model looks like this. You would say below grade is a conventional shopping mall. You can lock up below grade if you wish to. But as soon as you come up above ground, the whole mall comes up as a series of individual buildings. And the point of those buildings is not that they create the building, it's that they create the interstitial space. It creates the public realm between the buildings. And if you are designing for users of buildings rather than for owners of buildings, what the users of buildings mostly interact with is the space in between buildings. The experience of walking through a town, whether you like it or not, will depend on whether that experience is a pleasant one or not for the user walking by every day. The experience for the architect is, hey, you know, I got it built, it looks great, it's won an award. Okay, next. It's a momentary thing, you know, it's a transient thing, but for the users, it's there for at least the next 60 years. So for the users, we have to get it right. So the public realm actually became the point of engagement with the project for all of these people, and it became a huge successful event. The next step in this was the next project, which I will take you through to. Please just flip through the corporate. Next. Just one back. Was this one? Same developer. Because on the basis of the risk that they took, going down this unconventional route with us, actually it was rather forced on them, because they inherited a part-built building. Because it worked, when they found another site in Chengdu, in western China, right in the heart of that major city, they came back to us and said, you know, we want to do it again. I mean, we want to tweak it, improve it, make it better, make it more operational, make it functionally even more successful. So this is what we came up with, okay? The site, this Tianfu Square is the traditional center of the city. This was the political center of the city. It's where China, I think there's a massive statue of Mao Zedong there, the first Communist Party chairman, in that square. I think it's the biggest that they have in the country. So this was the major kind of political center, but the commercial centers started to move out in this direction, slightly southeast. And the site that we inherited, or that Swire purchased, was this one here. Now that was actually quite an interesting thing, because although it looks a little bit split up, it's not. this element here is actually an operating temple complex. That temple has been there for well over 1,000 years, and it has been operating for well over 1,000 years, and it is still operating to this day. So we have this major problem. You know, how do you take something which is essentially a contemplative religious anchor, a site with an anchor which is contemplative and religious, and wrap around it an overtly commercial, noisy, trading, money exchanging operation like a shopping center? So again, the process is all about the context. It's all about the subject of this festival. The first thing we did was to actually examine what was going on around the area. Actually, in this case, it didn't actually help us very much, because much of what had been there had already been destroyed, and high-rise towers had been pulled up all the way around. But the one thing that could never be touched was the temple complex. And that started to drive certain criteria. It drove the first key criteria, which was the height limits. We couldn't build something which would be overwhelming immediately adjacent to the temple, which of course is a low-rise building, it's a two-story building, a set of buildings. So that was the first issue. Second issue was, because that set of buildings has been there in one form or another for over 1,000 years, there is a humongous amount of cultural identity attached to those buildings. So for us, it meant that we needed to find a way to, using a modern expression, an expression of the 21st century, but find a way of adapting that to suit the adjacency of this very deeply cultural piece of architecture that was sitting right there in the middle. We also had to take on board a number of existing ancient buildings and adaptively reuse them, and in one case we had to completely rebuild one because it had actually fallen into such a state of disrepair. But all of that is now back up and running. Okay. So references, the usual kind of historic stuff, going back, looking at in our case, we started to look at roof lines, we started to look at materials, traditional colorways within the architecture and so on. Okay, and here's the plan. So essentially what we did was we came up with a strategy that said, temple complex, leave it alone. Can't touch that. Okay. Immediately adjacent to that temple complex, around here, we would create a zone. And that zone was to be what we called the slow lane. It's that dotted line that you see running around there. The slow lane. And that meant it started to indicate to us that we needed to put things which were less commercially noisy in that area. Things which were of themselves tending to be a bit more contemplative and quiet. So essentially what you find around this area now is quite a large array of food and beverage. Most of it is of the kind of what I would describe as the cafe culture kind of food and beverage. Okay, so food and beverage operations that happily spill out onto that walkway, onto the sidewalks there. So you have tables and chairs right out there in the street, and people just sit there quietly. They're doing their social media, or they're reading an old-fashioned newspaper, enjoying a cup of coffee, having lunch, whatever they're doing, and it's quiet. So it allows this buffer between the real commercial stuff going on here and the religious stuff going on here. So we had this kind of cushion effect in there, like a kind of middle of a donut, if you like. Okay. Then we had something that we call the fast lane, and the fast lane essentially runs round this way and through. Okay, so the fast lane was where you get all of your normal retail. Now this is actually quite interesting, because in this situation, immediately across the road from us are a series of high-rise buildings, one of which is the IFC, This is a building that was put up by the Wharf Development Company from Hong Kong. Traditional Hong Kong shopping centre. Podium, shopping mall, office towers on top. If you look at the mix, the merchandise mix, or the retail mix that we have in here, and look at the retail mix that they have, you'll find exactly the same brands across the road from each other. If you go into this site, you'll find it full of people. If you go into the fully enclosed Hong Kong, traditional Hong Kong mall, you'll find it empty. Which actually speaks volumes for the notion that people engage with the public realm. It's not just the brands that are pulling them in. It's something else. Every brand that you see in any mall, anywhere in the world, you can buy at the next mall down the road. There are plenty of choices for you. So why do you choose that particular mall? And I think as architects in this area, we really do have to interrogate that. We have to know what it is about the site which is driving people. We think it's to do with things like, of course, user-friendliness, openness, connections back into the local community, either virtual or actual physical connection. Either virtual in the sense of a kind of cultural identity which is not tangible, so intangible heritage, or tangible heritage, as in the case of architectural form. And most importantly, there has to be something which, very difficult to define, but something that we would call authenticity. Authenticity of experience. That is what's going to drive people in. Some mix of that. It will vary site by site, but some mix of that. Now the other bit of serendipity here was that the landlord was able to negotiate with the local subway system, and they acquired this piece of land. And this piece of land was really important because this sits immediately above a metro station, a subway station. So essentially people are coming up the escalators here. There is a tunnel under this road. This is actually a very busy road running down here. And they come up into this area of the square. So straight out of the metro system and into this site, into a very nice, big, welcoming square. So that was a little bit of serendipity. The other thing was the mixed-use nature of it. We couldn't do residential here, it wasn't big enough. It's about 200,000 square meters. But what we could do was put in this area a high-rise office tower. So we do have a kind of resident working population right out there, and they need to come down and do lunch and do their shopping and whatever. So that's one of the kind of the key elements of the mixed use here. And the other was in this area we put in a hotel. It's a Swire operated hotel. It's called Temple House in this case. They have a number of hotels with the house branding. So we have Upper House in Hong Kong, we have Temple House here, we have Opposite House in the Beijing site, and so on. So these are dotted around. Now the developers, when they're looking at this, will go, well, yeah, this is all very well, but you know, how on earth do you fund all of this? Because this is, and we're talking in a China context here. All of this requires funding for long-term income. So now we're getting to the point where, as an architect, we have to start understanding the business. What is it for the developer that is going to make this work? And the key thing for the developer is, how do I minimize my upfront capital expenditure to do this lot, which I'm actually using to generate long-term income? So eventually, sometime way back there, in 20, 30 years' time, I might get my money back. And how do I actually extract cash from this development early on to reduce that expenditure? For Swire, it was quite simple. You get a very good architect, Make architects, to design your high-rise office tower. You fit it out, you get it into a really good A-grade status and position, and sell it. So that was gone. They don't operate that office tower anymore. And the money that they took out of the construction of that office tower was ploughed back into the site to mitigate, to reduce the investment that they had in the operation of the shopping mall itself. Okay. So as a kind of a mixed-use development, it's actually quite curious. We have a mixture of culture, local identity, hotel, office, and TOD, transport-orientated development going on here. So all of these kind of form an important mix in trying to find a retail model, essentially, that is going to work within the local context. Now that works in Chengdu. It wouldn't work in Beijing. The one in Beijing does work in Beijing, but it is not interchangeable with this. The only thing which is interchangeable between these is the thought process. Everything else is fundamental. Everything else goes back to your basic research, what is going on in the area, within the context of the site that you're working with. Next. Okay, so a few views of this. Okay, here you have a very clear idea of the routing. Okay, the slow lane and the fast lane running through. Some references to some of the original architecture. This is some of the original stuff that was going on in the temple complex itself, okay? And where we started taking our cultural references from. And then we start thinking about how architecturally are we going to pull all this this mess, together into something which has some kind of architectural integrity, so that when you move through this space after it's built, it actually feels like one continuous space that you're moving through, but is actually allowing a certain kind of village expression. What do you mean by village expression? One of the best examples I can think of, and I use frequently, is a kind of European town square, and I'm sure you've got them here in the older parts of the city and older parts of other cities. The town square, in the middle of that, the town square, or the market square, if you like. Okay. And if you look at what goes on around the edge of the market square, it is a complete variety of different things that have happened over different periods of time. So that whole area acquires a kind of patina and a kind of historic context, which is not actually 100% continuous. The stores that you have today were not the stores you had 300 years ago, right? Clearly. The shop front systems that you use today were not the shop front systems that they used back then, clearly. But the buildings are still the same. They're still historic. Many of these things go back hundreds of years. And we wondered whether we could learn from that and try to recreate this kind of village feeling within this site. Well, what that led us to, first in Beijing and then here, was the notion that what we could do is perhaps build an architectural typology which would try to bridge the requirements, the opposing requirements of the retailer and the owner. And most of us here who've worked with shopping centre owners will understand exactly what that dichotomy is. There's a point of tension which is almost impossible to bridge. Because on the one hand, the owner, who, just like architects, has a big ego, right? Just like the rest of us, they are, after all, human. The owner wants the iconic corporate statement. And you can think of any of your developers here. Doesn't matter who they are. I'm not wishing to be rude to anybody. This is just an observation of fact. All developers do this. Ayala will do it. SM will do it. Aboitiz will do it. In Hong Kong, Swire Properties will do it. Hong Kong Land will do it. Chiangong will do it. Sanongay Properties will do it. They all need an expression of their corporate power and corporate identity to come out of this architecture. Now that's part of their corporate culture, and we have to take that on board. You can't just go slap, 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 get back in your box, you're just a developer, go away. You have to accommodate that. Okay? But on the other hand, these guys are looking to make long-term income, long-term gains out of their business model from all the retailers who are going to occupy this. What does the retailer want? Because if the retailer is not successful, the shopping centre is going to be a failure. Well, what the retailer wants is, of course, hard to guess. An expression of their corporate power, their corporate identity, their unique trading position, their USP, which is all about their branding. So you now have two massively conflicting issues. The retailers want a certain kind of branding, and the developers want something completely different, a different kind of branding. So we've got to bridge that. So we came up with this idea that maybe what we could do is, in this case, use the dominant architectural feature historically from this Sichuan area, the Chengdu area, which essentially is the roof line. We just started studying historic examples of roofs and worked a system, eventually, this was adopted, we worked a system of bringing that roof concept into the 21st century and remodeling it in a modern context. Below the roof line then, we didn't really have to do anything, just glass boxes, and allow the retailers to express themselves to the maximum extent that they wanted to. All we had to do was to make sure that the lid sitting on top of this development was strong enough to give the corporate expression that the developer wanted. Okay. So here we started looking at some of the analysis that went through. This is just one of the thousands of pages of such analysis that we did. We're looking at combinations of local color, but in particular looking at structure, looking at how these building typologies actually came about originally, and then trying to resolve those into a more modern context. Okay. And finally, that's what the total looks like. So down in this corner here, which you can't see, is where the subway system links. Okay, and it comes out here. These are the escalators that come out from under the road and into that shopping centre. So people are being delivered directly away from traffic, total traffic segregation. There is no vehicular traffic in here whatsoever, apart from EVA, that's all. But there's no vehicle access inside this site. It's all pedestrian. Okay, next. Oh, sorry, can you just go back one? And as you can see here on this corner, this is Gucci, and Gucci actually chose to adopt a fully transparent facade at that point. So basically, it's just a big glazed front with an enormous logo on it, so that people can actually get transparency through into the shop itself. But as you go back through into these little lanes, and you can see now how all of this works as a series of open walkways, a network of pathways, where actually you're not just walking around a shopping mall loop anymore, but it's a kind of journey of discovery when you go into this area. And one of the key things about that is that we need then to start thinking not just about the beauty of public realm, but the practicality of it too. So how do we, in dealing with the design of this external environment, given that the interior is largely given back to the retailers, how do we ensure that people don't get lost as they're moving around this? At that point, in comes the whole concept, a very different concept of corporate art. There is an enormous amount of investment in public art in this site, starting with initially this, which is really just a totem, an identifying totem for the whole site. But as we walk into the site, we'll show you more. Okay. There's local inspirations, more and more and more. Okay, coming up from the underground system. There's the Gucci store, completely transparent all the way through. So they're expressing their brand, the power of their brand, to the extent that they want to. And the whole thing being held together by this identification through the roofing structure. Okay, next. And here it is in use. There are some images of other projects here where we were still of the mind that our architecture needed to be seen in its, how would I describe it, in its pure form. I.e., it looks rather like, in some, not this, I'll show you the example, it looks rather like the place has been hit by a neutron bomb. It's left all the structures in place, but all the people have been annihilated, okay? So it's just don't exist. So the architecture is only there for me. It's not there for you. We don't need users, we just need it for us, because it's only satisfying our architectural need, okay? We've actually stopped doing that now, because we've realized that there is actually a triangular relationship between the operators, the retailers on one side, the owners and developers on the other side, and the key component that we never engage with is called the user. That third point of that triangle, which gives you a kind of rather nicely stable structure, is almost never ever asked what they would like within a given development. And that's something that I think, as an architectural profession, we have to really think about. And I think as architects, we actually have to address. How do we engage with the people who are going to be using this for the next 50 or 60 years? We're not going to be using it. The owner's not going to be using it. He's just going to be owning it, might be managing it. The people that are using it, these are the guys that are going to determine whether this is going to be successful or not. So, populated. This is just a kind of random day. It's always like this. The Beijing store is exactly the same. That story is identical. In fact, in Beijing, the freezing cold winters, you still have people hanging out in the square. They've got big puffy jackets on and overcoats and stuff, and they're all clutching beers, you know, doing whatever they do, just hanging out there. They're not rushing inside for the central heating. They're staying outdoors in order to enjoy that socialization that's going on out there. In the heat of the summer, they're out there. But shorts and singlets and whatever, just like here. Lots of water features, as some of which I've seen around here, that are there not just for, you know, the jumping fountains. They've been put in there, obviously they provide entertainment, but the key point about them is that they are affecting the microclimate. Because you know, when you put down lots of hard surfaces, as you have to in these kind of environments, you are going to land up with serious hot spots. So the ambient temperature inside a square might be much higher than outside. How do you deal with that? Well, you engage with really good quality engineers, and you get them to look at the microclimate. They will advise you on things like prevailing winds, temperature differentials, sunshine inclination movements, where you're going to get heat gain, where you're not going to get heat gain, where you need to have transparency, where you need to have solid thermal barriers, how to orientate your buildings. None of this is accidental. These little lanes and wibbly wobblies that go all over here, they're not accidental. They're all quite deliberate, and they're all devised as a result of that collaboration between all parties concerned. Okay, next. So this is actually a very good example of how the roofline works. Next. Something that we learned from our first experience, and you do go on learning forever. It never stops. If it does stop, it actually means you've just died. So please carry on learning forever. Okay. This upper level, it's very easy to get people in this kind of environment to occupy the ground level. It's no problem. You know, people like it, it's cool, it's kind of a bit funky, they've got mates there, you can hang out in the cafes, you can, you know, do whatever. But the problem has always been how the vertical circulation. How do you get people up to that next level? The mistake we made in Beijing was that we actually, at the upper level, created a series of pathways, interconnecting pathways up there in the sky, to link the second level buildings together. But what we didn't think of at that point was that these connecting areas are not just connectors, they're not just footpaths. If it's just a footpath, nobody's going to go there. So in this case what we did is that we started to explore the second level by creating really wide, actually not footpaths, but plazas up in that sky area. So when you're up on this area, if you're sitting at a cafe or something there, you feel that you're still on the ground floor, because literally you're sitting in a space like this tent. Okay? And it's only when you go to that wall over there that you realize you're on the first floor. You know, there's another level below. So that was a very key point of learning for us. And it's very difficult to explain that to most developers, because they'll look at that and go, but hang on a second, you just want to get somebody from here to here. Why has it got to be so wide? Why did I spend that much money on concrete and reinforcing and, you know, and? I mean, it's crazy. Just, you know, 1.2 meters, maybe? Okay, 2 meters. Okay, yeah. 2 meters is fine. 2 meters is not fine, because nobody's going to use it. They won't go there. It is not attractive, it's not interesting, it just doesn't draw people. But if it's a place where people feel they can go and hang and just dwell, that's when it starts to work. So we addressed that in this development, and I'm pleased to say that it's worked. The upper level is extremely vibrant, as you can see with the population running through it. So the view down from one of those. This building is an original historic building within the site. This is one of the things that we had to adaptively reuse and preserve, because it has historic cultural identity value. Okay? So those became quite important, iconic points of reference for us in terms of developing the architecture surrounding it. Same again. Okay, here we have the slow lane as seen from above. Very quiet ambulatory area. This shallow pond has clearly decorative intent, but it also has microclimate intent as well. That's something, evaporative cooling in that area noticeably brings down the temperature within that enclosed square. So these kind of passive approaches to modifying climate actually do work, and need to be considered in your work, in your schemes. Next. The temple complex itself, with the quiet the quiet cafe area on the other side. Next. And then of course this whole thing about collective memory. Where do you get collective memory from, and how do you create it? You need to create it because you want people to go away and go, hey, you know, that amazing sculpture, did you see that sculpture of that little dog? It's amazing, it's a really cute dog, you know, in that blah, 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 blah. It registers in people's minds. It is the hook that brings them back. So an enormous amount of money has been spent on this public art area. Artists from around the world were commissioned to come in and produce this. Chinese artists, artists from the UK, from France, from all over the place came in to erect these works, specially commissioned. So essentially what we're trying to do is that statement there. Just create a place for everyone. That for us is a kind of better, gives us a better understanding of this rather awkward expression, placemaking. What does placemaking really mean? What is it for? Who is it for? Why are we doing it? So we tend to change the definition slightly, or the expression of it, to a place for everyone. Okay, this is another little project that we did in Hong Kong. How are we doing for time, by the way? Anybody? Taryn, how are we doing for time? 10 minutes, okay, fine. This is a tiny project that we did in Hong Kong, because one of the key questions here now, I was actually challenged on this yesterday. I was having a conversation with a colleague over there, and actually making the point of this three-pole approach that we need to develop. The users, the owners, and the architects. Okay, these three opposing forces that have to operate somehow to make things work. But this just is a tiny project which gives some indication of how we work, how we try to address this. It's not perfect. We are as much in the dark on this as everybody else is. We're trying to actually engage with people as far as we possibly can. So, Star Street. This area is very old Wan Chai. This is the oldest part of the Wan Chai area in Hong Kong. So it's right up against the mountain. I can't read the road names. Excuse me while I stand back here. Okay, Sun and Moon Street, right. So essentially up here, along that boundary, is the old Queen's Road East of Hong Kong. Queen's Road East used to be, in Victorian times, the waterfront. So everything from Queen's Road East going north is now reclaimed land. Okay, so this part of old Hong Kong is original Hong Kong Island. No reclamation in here. And it is populated by, or characterized by, a number of rather small streets that are not very accessible. Vehicles can use them, but not very easy. They're too narrow. And rather small 3, 4, 5-story buildings, and maybe some tiny little residential towers now around. And there is an enormous drop from this level to this level. There's a huge stone wall creating that boundary, and a set of steps going down here. Very run down. These little alleyways along here were occupied by like little car repair shops, that kind of, one-man mechanic operations. Maybe some distribution, food distribution, storage, that kind of thing. Really, really down, low end stuff. Okay. On this side here, on the opposite side of this street, is a major Swire Properties development. It's called 3 Pacific Place. Many of you will have seen the original Pacific Place, which is over here, behind me, if you like. 3 Pacific Place is a relatively new office tower that was put up there. And up at this end, down there, is one of the original Swire residential developments. Okay, so they have a lot of interest in this area. And they looked at this and they said, look, there are a number of things we want to do. First of all, we would like to commission you to design probably the world's smallest apartment tower. This is a building of about 25, 26 stories. Each floor has precisely one apartment on it. And each apartment is about 400 square meters in total, okay, excluding the elevator and escape stairs. Okay, so it just gives you an idea of scale. You're talking about a building which is 1 room wide and almost 1 room deep in local terms here in the Philippines. So that was the first thing that we did. But then the second thing they said was, okay, so now we've got an office tower, we've got a residential thing here, we've got a small pencil, we call them pencil towers, so they just stand up like a pencil, they're really thin. A pencil tower up here, which they sold very successfully. But they said, but actually, Swire being Swire, their view is that they're not quite developers, per se. They like to imagine themselves to be community builders. And you can say, yeah, blah, blah, it's all corporate kind of yap. I think in the case of this particular developer, they actually do mean it in some way. And one of the things they like to do is to try and put back something into the community. It's in their own interest to do so, because if they can raise the quality and status of the surrounding area, they're actually protecting the asset value of their big properties that they've got here, right? So it's not quite entirely altruistic. There is a kind of a personal, corporate logic behind doing that, but at least they do it. So they asked us to have a look at how we might actually assist the local area surrounding these badly neglected streets, and try and bring them up to a higher standard and something that people might actually use. There were two things associated with it. There was a little park here that was rather dingy and unused, unloved, and right onto this main road running past here, the Queen's Road. A commercial building here, another big commercial building here, and this big wall at the back. So it's just fully enclosed. It's like a little box and one side missing. And the other piece was hidden here along this street. It was all actually just a piece of wasteland. It had no useful purpose whatsoever. So we went in and we said, well, look, I mean, maybe these are things that we can do. Perhaps we can actually look at dealing with those two spaces, and perhaps we can have a look at dealing with some of the street finishes. Just not knocking down buildings and rebuilding, not even redecorating buildings, although they do that too. They go and they buy individual house units, and they'll put some money in and raise the quality. And what happens is that tends to create nodes of high quality, and the adjoining owners will then follow, because they realize that improve the quality of this piece of property here, and they're actually doing quite well. They're getting a lot more rent for their property than I am. So it's now proven worth my while to improve my property. So the whole district starts to improve. People start to reinvest in their own properties and bring that level up. So we then embarked on an interesting little journey, one of which was negotiate with government, because one of the key things that we wanted to do was to address this particular street here. And this was horrible. The broken paving slabs, those horrible concrete things, all the curbs. Somebody was talking about broken curbs in the discussion earlier today. We have exactly the same thing. All those curb stones that are all cracked and broken and out of alignment, and horrible mess, dreadful mess. And this is immediately adjacent to a very expensive high-rise A-grade office building. It kind of doesn't make sense. So, one, how do you deal with that? You don't own the land, you don't own the footpath, you don't own the road. So you have no choice, you have to go to government. Governments, I guess, I imagine here in the Philippines it's much the same. Department A doesn't talk to Department B doesn't talk to Department C, right? It's all siloed. We have the same thing, big time. So we have, in Hong Kong, Lands Department. They deal with the value of land. We have Transport Department. They deal with roads and pavements. They don't talk to each other. Then we have police, because they have a say in what you do on the streets, because they have to patrol those streets, right? And they don't talk to these other two departments either. So it's a nightmare, a total nightmare, just to get the pavements repaired. We got there. We managed to find our way through to a higher level within government with the help of the client, and we got some government support. And you'd think it was a no-brainer, but it took months to get there. It was a no-brainer because the developer was saying to government, we will follow your codes, we will follow your design standards, your specifications, and we will pay for all the work. No budget required. It took months for the government to actually realize what was being offered to them. So that perseverance was really important. Engagement, again, it's engagement, and it's trying to get, we're talking here about context, try to get government to understand what context means. And then you realize how a word that is, context, how difficult it is to actually realize that in reality. So we did it. This whole street became repaved, and what you see there now is actually I wouldn't say it's a kind of exquisite example of anything, but it's infinitely better than it was. But then, importantly, there are people living around here, and we said, well, if we're going to do something else, if we're going to deal with these pieces of land, these are the bits of land that they kind of overlook from their apartments, they walk past them every day. Don't you think we ought to be engaging with them? And this is how we did it. We took one of those little shops in one of those Sun, Moon, Star Street areas, and we just did a little bit of graphic branding on it, and we turned this into a kind of consultation, drop-by consultation office. Okay, and within that there was an exhibition set up, so you can see some of these little very simple static exhibits, nothing fancy, nothing interactive or whatever. The interactive part was a bunch of yellow post-it stickers, and people were invited to come in, look at some initial sketch proposals that we'd prepared for this event, write down their comments on yellow stickers and just whack them up, or to try and get that feedback from them. We also invited people in to come and talk. So that's one of us, Chris Law from Oval Partnership, Gordon Ongley from Swire Properties. So the big developer, the big architect, coming right down to the street and engaging very directly with these people who are the people who live in the neighborhood, and engage with them directly to say, this is what we're proposing, but tell us, what do you want? And most people will come back to us and they'll say, God, if you ask them what they want, geez, man, do you know how much it's going to cost? Oh, the shopping list is going to be this long. Surprisingly, it's not. People are actually remarkably modest about what they want. So in the process, we came up with this very modest little intervention that the local population could support. And it was actually about the recreation of those two little parks in there. Okay. Next. This is where that would be the site of the shop here. This is that little final terrace, and then over here there's the wall that drops down to right down to the lower level next to Queen Street. Next. So at the end of the day, we came up with a scheme, which is what they wanted. What they said was, well, essentially, we just want somewhere where we can go and hang out. We'd like to be able to go and sit down under trees. We'd like to be able to chat with the neighbors. We'd like to be able to have somewhere where the kids can kick a football around or ride a tricycle or whatever in this immensely dense urban space that we occupy. So working directly with that interface, we came up with a redesign of this. And this has started to be used on a regular basis, partly driven by us, and partly spontaneously. Next. Next. This is actually quite interesting. This little wall here does attract surprising amounts of interest, because behind my back is Queen's Road now and the old seashore area. And what this is doing is tracking the story of the development of that sea line, the successive waves of reclamation that went out over a century and a half or so. And people are actually interested enough to stop and read this stuff, which rather surprised me, I have to say. But so there is an engagement from the local population wanting to know what used to happen here. Next. And this brings me to a kind of final point, really, I guess. This literally, Fei Zhou He Long means very Hong Kong. It's a direct translation from between Chinese and English. Very Hong Kong Foundation is something that we established, and we established it because we wanted to find out ways of engaging directly with the grassroots. As architects, we realized that we had floated ourselves up to this level, and we were not engaging with the people who are actually using the products of our work. So we set up Very Hong Kong, and the objective of this was to engage directly with grassroots people and give them the opportunity to occupy the streets in a positive manner. Bear in mind, this is all done with the background of the Occupy movement in Hong Kong, that fierce, you must have seen it, the protest movement that grew out of the youth movement in Hong Kong and actually took over whole reams of streets in central Hong Kong and shut large tracts of the city down. And that was a necessary expression of political frustration. Unfortunately, it didn't bear any fruit, but I think it was a necessary thing for them to do. This was at about the same time that we were trying to depoliticize, because the movements around were becoming very negative. The sentiment was becoming very negative, and we were getting more and more anxious about that. So there was a dual thing here. One was to try to get something more positive happening on the streets at the same time in parallel, which is apolitical, and B, use that opportunity to engage with local people and find out who they are, what they do. And we were very surprised with what we found. We started doing a series of events. This was the one specifically related to that little park, and it was called Very Street. So, and we've done several. Very Hong Kong has produced a Very Kwun Tong, it's produced Very Aberdeen, it's produced Very Central, and it's produced Very Star Street, and this one. Okay, and basically, essentially, what we do is that we continue our negotiations with government and say we want to use this for a public event, and it's actually all about engagement with local people. It's not political, and it's more like a kind of festival. It's almost like a market, where people can come and show what they do. If they're making things at home, they can come and sell them. People are selling homemade beer in places like this. They're showing people how to make paper flowers and all these kind of arts and crafts that are being done behind closed doors in Hong Kong and never get an outlet, are now suddenly flooding onto the street. And we have tens of thousands of people attending these events whenever they come on. They're all free. There's a massive amount of organization that goes into them. Musicians come into it, food and beverage people come into it. There's a huge movement in Hong Kong which is about fashion swap. Okay, so you bring in, a bag full of clothes that you want to trade. Somebody does a little kind of evaluation of that. You leave your clothes there, and you go through and you pick off the shelves something to the equivalent value that you want. It's second hand. And this is actually opening up an entire new kind of barter trade market amongst young people in Hong Kong. So they have this massive city-wide wardrobe they can choose from, put it that way, to keep changing the look and changing the fashion. Hugely successful, and they come to this. Loads of musicians, as you can see, come to this as well. So next. This is all about photography taken on cameras. Okay, so just no editing, no photoshopping, no nothing. It was just people on the street coming back, hey, I want to show my photos. And others come along and engage with that, see what's going on. Next. And it's interesting because you talk to any government official in Hong Kong and they'll say, hey, you know what? We Hong Kong people, we don't do outdoors. We don't do outdoors, it's too hot, it's too sticky, we don't like getting sunburned, and And time and again, I look at these photos and I go, why don't you just get out of your air-conditioned office and go for a walk one day? See what people are actually doing. Because this is what they're doing. Next. Schools involved. Okay, this was part of the same thing. One of the streets was completely commandeered. All of these little food and beverage outlets along these back streets, after we'd done the street improvement works around the area, they all suddenly turned into restaurants instead of car repair shops now. We negotiated with government to close those streets down for the festival. Okay, And this was the result. Next. So it just became a market for a day, for 2 days, one weekend. People came out, trestle tables were laid out, and they sold their stuff. Lots of stuff, typical street market, okay? But just not done in this area before, ever, in the heart of Wanchai. Next. We always do these big walls, these graphic walls. They're amazing. Everybody engages with that. Next. And then we cleared the street and we turned it into a fashion catwalk. This is a nice long narrow street. So one of the shops at the end gave their shop to, these are all fashion students' work. Okay? They gave their shop to the students and to the models. So the shop became the back of house, the changing room, you know. So the models would disappear into the shop and come out with another outfit, and then they would go marching off down the street as a catwalk parade. Thousands of people were watching this. And no other way for these students to get their products, their creations out there to be seen by this kind of general public. So again, that immediate engagement, public to public, was starting to happen. Next. Next. Okay, this is very Kwantong, derelict space. This is a flyover along the harbour front on the Kowloon side, and underneath it there is nothing. I mean nothing, just dirt. It's just nothing, derelict land. And negotiation with government, with highways, with transport department, police, around the time of the Occupy movement, and finally we got permission to use this space. And suddenly, in this very heavily industrial area called Kwantong, we found tens of thousands of people flooding out over 2 days to come and enjoy something which was of them, by them, and for them. Didn't cost them anything, but they had a brilliant weekend, exposing what they do, what they think, what they play, what music they listen to, what fashion they wear. This whole market sort of festive occasion erupted on a piece of land. So, and as a result of all of this, we were able to feed on this and start to understand what people really do. Because honestly, until we'd done this, we hadn't got a clue. We just didn't know what the people of Hong Kong did. Everybody would say, what do Hong Kong people do? Oh, shopping, food. Okay, what else do they do? More shopping, more food. And it's actually patently not true. It isn't true. You know, there's all this stuff happening, and we can't see it because we don't let it out. So this is our approach to trying to get some kind of public engagement. Yours will be different, but I guess my message to you is that a really fundamental part of context, going back to the theme of this festival, really fundamental part of context is the context of the user. Because without them, we're building castles in the air. I guess I better stop there because I know I'm over time.
Okay, thank you very much, Patrick Bruce. So,
I just like to commend you with the projects you have done. Hello. I'd like to tell you a concern here means because fortunately for most of our projects, especially retail spaces, we came across certain limitations like for example, we have very small lot areas given to us by clients. So in your years of practice, have you come up with a certain ratio or I think percentage of open, how much open space do we need to provide for the social relations of the people, for the users, and how do we defend for for the saleable areas versus the open space for the client?
The decision is largely regulated. It's government regulated. So at the time that a developer bids for a site or a site comes onto the market. Some feedback going on there. Thank you. By the time a site comes onto the market for bidding, developer bids for it, it is already established what the site coverage can be. It's already established how much green area there has to be, and it's already established in terms of height limits and GFA. So that tends to also determine the slab-to-slab heights as well that you can achieve. So yeah, there is no specifically defined percentage. It does depend on purpose, I think. If I were to be put into a situation where a developer in, say, China, where maybe they have slightly more relaxed regulatory framework, then I would be asking the question, what is the purpose of this development? Really, and where is the development? Is it in a very high-rise, very high-density area? Or is it in an area where we actually do have a little bit more breathing space available to us? But one of the ways in which some developers have dealt with this, to varying degrees of success, is not entirely successful, I think. But one is that buildings are elevated off the ground, so the first story is actually the first story, not the ground story, not the ground floor. And that area, that undercroft, it then becomes public flow space. A good example of that is, in Hong Kong context, is the Norman Foster designed Hong Kong Bank, which goes back, 1970s, I think. It still looks like it is a 21st century building. But that public space, that undercroft, is used extensively by people, and it provides a really interesting connection between what is called Battery Path, which is the old part of government land that goes up onto the hill by St. John's Cathedral. So you can imagine you've got a cathedral up on the hill, you come down Battery Path, you walk across into the undercroft of the Hong Kong Bank, and that then links through across essentially tramways and a bus lane into another park called Statue Park. So you get that kind of connectivity running between the main open areas and the main thoroughfares, allowing that kind of access. But I don't think there is a specific proportion that you can lay down without actually seeing the context of the site and what its connectivity is and what it needs to be.
Thank you. You for presentation. The projects are amazing. The question is the activation with festival, catwalk, and all the event program that you showed us that obviously drive a massive footfall. How the management of this program happen, and how much is responsibilities of the designer, and how much instead you have to engage with like other companies, like event organizer, to carry out after you finish the project throughout the life of the mall?
Issues there. Looking at the last project, the street festival thing. The management of those street festivals, those go on over just like a 2-day period. They're just a one-weekend event. And the event is actually organized by us. We have, exactly as William deals with this event, we deal with those. So we commandeer people. We go out, and it's amazing. I mean, just social media, we seek volunteers, and they just keep coming. Because there's something about this engagement process which in itself is engaging. People want to be involved in the organization of it, and they want to get, their hands dirty doing something like this. So we find a kind of spontaneous response that comes from the general public, and usually very young people come forward to help with this. Yes, we have to put in quite a lot of management ourselves, because we have to do all of that management and coordination part ourselves. we have to seek sponsorships to make things work. We have to find all of the kind of ancillary equipment that's needed to be brought on site and get people to deal with that too. So it's a huge undertaking. It's not a simple kind of matter. There is a substantial amount of activity that has to go on, and of course all the negotiation with police and the transportation departments, etc., etc. All of that's got to be done by us. The second part is to do with the management of events in the shopping centres themselves. Okay, so that's a really fundamental part of our initial briefing. When we're dealing with a company like Swire, it's a kind of no-brainer. They've been in the business of running malls for decades now. That's their bread and butter. They know how to do this stuff. Okay. So when it comes to getting them to engage with a street art program, it's not a problem. You know, they'll fund it. We'll go out to their art consultants because they have them. We'll go out to their event organizers and managers because they have them. Their marketing people will go out to other corporations. So a lot of these spaces, these big public open spaces, are occasionally given over to product launches or fashion shows, you know, fashion launches or fashion parties, you know, whatever goes on. Car launches will take place in this, and that's all professionally, and we have nothing to do with that at all. So at the level of street art, yes, of course, they're working directly with their own consultants, and we do get involved with that on a fairly ongoing basis, because there are structural and architectural constraints that people have to work within. But beyond that, we don't have an involvement. No. But it is important because when talking to other developers, as a result of those projects, a lot of other developers have come forward to us and said, you know, we've seen what you did in Chengdu, we've seen what you did in Beijing, we really like it, blah, blah, blah. Can you do one for us? And that's a kind of a nightmare question for me, because the answer is, well, yeah, we can. We can create the physical infrastructure there for you. We can design the buildings, we can advise you on the mix, we can work out the circulation, we can do the analysis, all of that kind of stuff for you. That's not a problem. The key question is, once we hand that building over to you, are you able to manage it? That's a very difficult question to ask a developer, because it's like telling him, are you competent? And it sounds a bit kind of arrogant. So we have to find kind of more gentle ways of engaging with them. But it's really crucial that you have to kind of get under the skin of the owners and start to understand what they are capable of delivering. Because if you ask them to deliver something they cannot, you know you've got a failure on your hands. So that is actually a very important point.
Okay.